Do you or a loved one have health problems related to the water contamination at Camp Lejeune? If so, you need to watch this video. Thousands of Marines and their families have been affected by the water contamination at Camp Lejeune. Despite years of advocacy by veterans and their families, the government has yet to provide adequate compensation or medical care for those suffering from the effects of contaminated water at Camp Lejeune. The Department of Veterans Affairs has acknowledged that exposure to contaminated water at Camp Lejeune can cause a number of serious health conditions, including many types of cancer, liver damage, birth defects, and reproductive problems. However, the VA has been slow to provide benefits to those affected. Countless Marines and their families have been denied justice over the past 70 years. However, there is a new piece of legislation that passed in the United States Senate that finally allows the victims of toxic water exposure at Camp Lejeune to get compensation for their injuries. In this video, I will give you a brief history of the Camp Lejeune water contamination lawsuit and how you can take action. Camp Lejeune is a United States Marine Corps base located in Jacksonville, North Carolina. It covers over 8,000 acres and is the largest Marine Corps base on the East Coast. The base was commissioned in 1941, and over 1 million men, women, and children have lived and worked on the base over the years. In the early 1980s, testing and studies conducted by the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry found that the water supply at Camp Lejeune had been contaminated with a variety of cancer-causing toxic chemicals for over 30 years. Between 1952 and 1987, Marines and their families drank, bathed, and cooked with the contaminated water that contained toxic chemicals including benzene, trichloroethylene, and perchloroethylene. The full extent of the contamination was not revealed until much later studies conducted in 2012, and by that time, many of those affected had already died. Thousands of others continue to suffer from chronic diseases such as cancer, leukemia, infertility, and birth defects as a result of the exposure to the water at Camp Lejeune. Prior to the passage of the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, none of the victims of water contamination at Camp Lejeune have been able to recover compensation for their injuries due to prior court rulings and an extremely restrictive statute of repose in the state of North Carolina. A 2016 ruling from the U.S. District Court in Georgia dismissed all claims made by Camp Lejeune victims based on the Ferris Doctrine. The Ferris Doctrine prevents military service members from suing the government for any injuries that occurred during their service, including those on a military base. This ruling effectively removed any legal recourse the victims had to file a lawsuit, since the exposure to the contaminated water happened to active duty service members on a military base, and claims for family members were barred by the North Carolina Statute of Repose. The North Carolina Statute of Repose prevents anyone from filing a lawsuit more than 10 years after the cause of the injury. Many of the victims at Camp Lejeune were exposed anywhere from 40 to 70 years ago, making it nearly impossible to file a claim. To make matters even worse, nobody even knew about the water contamination problem until 1982, almost 30 years after veterans and family members were initially exposed. By the time anyone knew about the Camp Lejeune water problems, the 10-year statute of repose was already expired on most potential claims. Fortunately, there is a bill that passed through Congress called the Camp Lejeune Justice Act of 2022 that removes all the legal barriers and red tape so that the veterans and their families can finally have their day in court and get compensation for their injuries. If you or a loved one suffered injuries due to toxic water exposure at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987, the lawyers at Science & Kirk, PA can help. Get a free and confidential Camp Lejeune case review by calling 1-800-522-0102, clicking the link in the description, or visit us at youhavealawyer.com.